Now I have it to share with anyone who might like it later. We're going to continue our effort to try and learn something from the parasha, which is getting harder as we go along in the parasha cycle, because Zohar has a lot to say on Genesis and Exodus, and comparatively little to say on Leviticus, Numbers, and practically nothing on Deuteronomy. But there's still quite a bit in the Leviticus section. Notably, right, the Pritzker Zohar version that we're using has 10 volumes, the translation of the standard body of the Zohar, and Leviticus doesn't start until volume 7. So it tells you how disproportionate it is that actually the vast majority is on Genesis and Exodus. But as we just read Parashat Tazria, we thought we would start with a little thing that picks up from Parashat Tazria, actually with the very first verse of Parashat Tazria, which, as usual, has nothing to do with the content of Parashat Tazria, but instead uses as jumping off point to talk about birth, about conception, about souls, and about soulmates, or what we might call soulmates in a kind of contemporary sense, which is a topic that Zohar comes back to frequently. And there's a couple of themes here that we'll see repeated elsewhere. We may have seen repeated elsewhere before, because actually the Zohar repeats itself a lot. And the themes are tied together in a particularly typical way for the Zohar in terms of how it interprets texts and what it's trying to teach. So as usual, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you can see that. Screen share is loading. Okay. Can you see now? Okay. So excellent. Hi, David.
Hi, sorry, I was in the wrong waiting room.
That's okay. You weren't the only one. It was the one time I didn't remind everyone what the Zoom code is. So we're going to start with this quote from Parashat Tazria. And we're going to go immediately far from it. But just a little bit of context for what is taking place. So the very beginning of Parashat Tazria is so named because it begins when a woman yields seed. Already we have a fascinating and unanatomically correct conception of conception. But the notion in Tazria seems to be that it's interesting in terms of how the ancients understood conception, because actually much of the ancient world didn't understand women to contribute any genetic material, and rather a child was just a miniature version of the man that happened to grow in the woman's belly. The Torah at least acknowledges that there's some role to be played because it begins when a woman yields seed, tazria, which is literally the word for to seed something or to sow something. And then it goes on to describe when a woman yields seed and gives birth to a male child, she is kind of restricted in certain ways and also held to be apart from the community for 33 days. When she gives birth to a female child, she's held apart from the community for 66 days. There's no explanation given as to why the female child's period of restriction or confinement in some sense, although it's not necessarily negative, why it's doubled. So there's lots of interpretations, as you might imagine. The rabbis have a lot to say. I think probably the most common explanation for why the female child doubles the period of separation. And I purposely am not saying impurity, because although we often interpret it that way, the text actually seems to imply that she's in a period of purity. It talks about pure blood several times in the passage. So it's not like something's wrong. It's just that there's a kind of status where she's in a kind of limbo during the first weeks after giving birth. So the typical explanation for why that limbo, let's call it, lasts for twice as long for a female child is because in giving birth to a female child, she's also then given birth to the potential for the same procreative ability, the ability to yield seed and give birth to a child. And as a result, it's kind of duplicated. It's like almost a nesting doll concept of giving birth, that when a woman gives birth to a girl, she's now giving birth once more to another womb, which has the possibility of then having more children. Whereas for a male child, obviously, that's not the case. Don't know how convincing that is, but as usual, the Zohar doesn't care about convincing. It cares about how it can interpret the text to suit its particular ideological aims. So we have a little introduction here, which doesn't seem immediately connected, and then we dive into the details of how they understand the process of conception. Just want to say, obviously, the idea of conception, although it might seem bizarre to even think about it, it's incredibly important to contemporary political disagreements. There's a lot of people in America who spend a lot of time arguing over when exactly a soul enters a body, and they're not doing it in a religious setting, they're doing it in Congress. And that's because they're making decisions based on things like abortion and access to certain types of healthcare on the basis of the fact that the soul entering the body takes place at X point or Y point or Z point. So Zohar is in some way contributing to that discussion, although has no idea about the impact that might have. But it's also thinking about what actually is happening when a child is conceived. What's going on when that moment occurs that it goes from being simply genetic material from two parents to being a new life? And what stage is it a new life, and how does it develop? Okay. Someone want to read first? Robin, you're first on my screen if you're game.
Sure. So when a woman yields seed, Rabbi Chitzkiah opened, "How many are your words, O God? All of them you made in wisdom. The earth is filled with your creatures." In Psalms. "How many are the works of the king? This may be compared to a person who takes in his hand a conglomeration of seeds and sows them all at once, and subsequently each one emerges separately. Similarly, the Blessed Holy One made his works in wisdom, and wisdom took all as one and sowed them. Subsequently, each one emerged in its time, as is written, all of them you made in wisdom."
Okay. So this opening from Chizkiah doesn't seem immediately connected to the verse, which is not unusual, but actually does reflect, it's kind of somewhat not clear, but it does reflect one of the Zohar's assumptions about creation, which are not shared by the mainstream normative Judaism, which is that the Zohar thinks about creation more or less, again, to use the imagery of nesting dolls. The Zohar imagines that all creation happened in once, at one moment, and then all that's happened since then is that things gradually have developed. So in some way, it's actually not so different from how we think about the universe now, in the sense of that there was a big bang, right? A moment in which everything kind of, all the energy that was required for the universe to develop was at once released. But then that doesn't mean it immediately became the universe as we know it now. Over time, it expanded and grew and is continuing to expand, and things cooled and heated up, and elements changed and combined together and whatever. But you could say that everything that ever exists in our universe was there at the moment of the Big Bang, right? It was in that energy and in that creation, because there's nothing that's really been created that wasn't in the Big Bang. I think that's objectively true, at least according to contemporary and assumed scientific doctrine. So the Zohar is more or less saying the same thing about creation, is that creation happened all at once, like everything that would ever exist was created in one go. And then what really we see as creation is a process of gradual evolution in which all of that energy in the creation is just kind of manifesting itself, emanating, gradually molding and changing and morphing from one thing into another as it carries on throughout time. So the image here, right, of someone who takes all the seeds, sows them all at once, and then they all emerge separately, is very much trying to get us to think about creation in the sense of the fact that everything that will ever exist already is there. It just hasn't quite come to ripening yet. It hasn't come to the stage where it bursts out from the ground and becomes a flower, right? Some seeds, it's true of botany as well. Some seeds take hundreds of years in the soil before they ever actually emerge, and some emerge, you put them in June and they come out in January, or the reverse, probably more likely. And of course, right now we look outside, all sorts of things are popping out of the ground that you wouldn't have known were there 2 months ago. But what we know when we see the tulips pop out of the ground is they didn't just come out of nowhere, right? The seed was already there. It just wasn't ready yet. So that's how we're meant to think about creation as well. Everything that's created has already been created. It just hasn't reached the time at which it's coming into itself. It's manifesting itself, but the energy for it is there. Nothing is new. Does that make sense? Okay. It's not actually the way most people think about creation, by the way, right? And there's another approach in Judaism, which is more normative, which is that God is constantly creating everything, that everything is actually constantly renewed and being created, and that actually we're in the present tense very much. Creation is an ongoing process which is constantly happening. Whereas the Zohar very much takes the approach of it was a one-time deal, which we're now being able to analyze the results of somewhat mechanistically and academically. Okay, let's carry on.
Rabbi Abbas said, "How many are your works, O God? How many are the works of the Holy King, all concealed in wisdom, as is written, all of them in wisdom," from Psalms, all included in wisdom, issuing only by certain paths towards Binah, whence all is made and arranged, as is said, Yuvi Tvuna, and by understanding it is established, Proverbs. Thus, all of them in wisdom you made in Binah.
Okay. This is explaining what we just said, but in a sephirotic way, right? So the reason wisdom is capitalized here routinely is because what it's a reference to is the sphira of Chokhmah. For those who have spent any time with Sphirot, we try not to get too tangled in it, although if anyone wants to, very happy to. Keter is the beginning of the process, and then the energy that kind of explodes out of Keter mostly gets channeled through Chokhmah or wisdom, and then it gets passed on from Chokhmah to Bina, which is conceived of as kind of the womb. So everything that comes into the world is born out from Bina, but the energy from it is engaged in this kind of triangular structure in the upper realms. So again, it's that same idea that kind of nothing is really new. It's just undergoing a process of development. And Bina, which is thought of as a womb, thought of as an ocean. There's lots of interesting psychological metaphors for how we conceive of this idea of the place where it goes from being potential to actual. Bina is a very feminine aspect. And of course, the Zohar thinks it's got itself very clever proof text here, because they rely on this verse in which it says everything is arranged through uvitvuna, right? And through understanding, it's established, right? Tivuna is related to Bina. So they go, oh, of course, that's it. It proves the fact, right? Everything's established through Bina, even though it's all sewn into Chokhmah. And as a result, everything that comes out to the world is born the same way, which is actually, it's a really interesting way to think about creation. And it's also an interesting way to think about what happens when something goes from being potential to actual. Like, how does that go? And especially when we think about what happens, something going from spiritual to physical, which of course is what we're going to get onto when we think about the soul.
It's just thinking about what wisdom is in this context. I mean, what is it the same as what we mean by wisdom?
I mean, more or less, it's a metonym standing in for the idea of Chokhmah, the Sphira, rather than Chokhmah, i.e. wisdom, as a concept.
Yeah.
And what this actually goes back to, so when we use the word wisdom today, we mean someone who's clever or smart or whatever. But in the ancient world, particularly the Greek ancient world, wisdom was a personified characteristic, more or less a goddess, right? Her name was Sophia, which a lot of young girls are named today. And lots of the Greek literature talked about Sophia kind of as an entity, as something which existed in a real sense. And when we talk about people being wise, the idea was that they were kind of tapping into that higher wisdom, which is a personified, almost religious notion. So the Zohar picks up on that Greek idea, really, and makes wisdom a kind of being. It's not just the Zohar, right? The book of Proverbs is really very much part of that Greek tradition of talking about wisdom in a feminine capacity and as a kind of semi-divine entity, maybe like an angel we might think of. When we say wisdom down here, we talk about something being hacham. What we mean is that it's kind of related to that idea of wisdom, which is this creative organizing force. So a lot of our language is derived from that way of thinking, but we don't think about wisdom that way. When we say wisdom, we say that person's got a lot of wisdom. We don't think of, a particular figure, a personality, a female one especially.
Thanks.
Yeah. Do you want to read one more there, Robin?
Okay. The earth is filled, assembly of Israel, for from there she is filled with all, as is said, all the streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Ecclesiastes. The earth is filled with your creatures, for she generates them afterward, as is written. These are the generations of heaven and earth, Behibaream, when they were created, Behaberam, by he created them. Thus the earth is filled with your creatures.
Okay. Again, this is talking about the Sfirot, and it's a bit kind of technical, but the idea mainly is Assembly of Israel, Knesset Israel is one of the words for Shekhinah. We've seen that frequently. And so here we're talking about the earth is filled with all of the creatures, is a reference to the fact that all the things that are going to live on earth are already here, right, in that sense, and just need to be brought into being. And there's a very interesting connection to water imagery, both with Binah, the higher feminine aspect, and Shekhinah, the lower feminine aspect. And it uses this verse from Ecclesiastes very much to that end. All the streams flow into the sea, but the sea is not full, right? So all of this creative potency that Binah in the womb is giving birth to, it all actually comes to fruition through this Jacob's ladder of the Sfirot, out through Knesset Yisrael, the Shekhinah at the bottom, which is representative of the earth. And they try and prove this. Again, it's not very persuasive to us because we don't buy into the system probably, or most of us don't. But these are the generations of heaven and earth. It uses a strange verb there in that quote from the Torah. It says, Behi bare'am, when they were created. And it's Zohar is reinterpreting that, rearranging letters to say, Behei baram, with the letter Hey, they were created, and Hey being a symbol of Shekhinah. The second Hey in God's name is a symbol of Shekhinah. The first Hey is a symbol of Binah. So the Hey is feminine, which again, if you already were subscribed to that notion that, Yud and Vav are masculine letters and the Heys are feminine letters, then you go, oh yeah, of course. But if you don't, then it's not going to be particularly meaningful. By the way, it's not hard to see why Hey, so God's name is Yud Hey Vav Hey, right? The Yud and the Vav, right, are straight, they're angular, they're kind of phallic in nature. Hey is the only letter that is made up of two separate strokes that are disconnected, right? So it's inherently open. It's something which is, to be quite crass, penetratable, right? And as a result, it wasn't a big jump for them to think about Hey as being a feminine letter and Yud and Vav to be masculine letters. And because there's two Heys, it led even more to just thinking about the upper feminine, the lower feminine, both of which are the creative powers in the universe, both of which are conceived of in the ways that human women are conceived of, as giving birth and as nurturing the children, right? So Binah is kind of the mother figure giving birth, and Shekhinah is kind of our particular mother who cares for us or looks after us, who we have a relationship with. And as a result, we've heard a lot about Shekhinah, right, as a character, often called Matronita in the Zohar, the noble lady, more or less a kind of goddess figure, although everyone's afraid to say that. Okay, does that make sense? Kind of a strange intro between Chizkiah and Abba, and now we get into more of the teaching that makes up the bulk of this passage. Someone else want to read for a bit? Daniel, you're next on my screen if you're game.
Yeah, okay.
Can you see on your tiny screen?
Oh yeah, I'm on the iPad.
Okay.
So I can see. I only, where the pictures are at the bottom, I can't see the very bottom paragraph, but I can see it. So I'm starting from come and see.
That's right.
So come and see, when a man comes to sanctify himself, to couple with his female with intention of holy aspiration, another Holy Spirit is aroused above him, composed of male and female. The Blessed Holy One signals to a certain angel who is appointed over the conception of human beings, and entrusts him with that spirit, informing him where to deposit it. As is written, the night said, a male is conceived, Job 3:3. The night said to that minister, a male is conceived by so-and-so. And the Blessed Holy One commands that spirit with whatever he wishes, as has been established.
Okay. So, spoiler, we're talking about sex, right? And the notion here, obviously it gives a lot of agency to the male party, but the notion is that kind of sexual relations done right, in the right spirit and the right intention and with a kind of holiness to it, which is something that's assumed for the Zohar, is obviously what creates new life. And the idea is that while that's happening down below here on the earth, at the same time, there's this kind of bureaucratic process going on in heaven, right? Which is not a place, but a kind of alternate world for the Zohar, in which God is appointed a particular angel to put the souls in each of the babies, right? And in this case, we're not really talking about babies. We're talking about the earliest stage, zygote, right? More than anything else. And the notion here is that there's an angel who's charged with that, whose job it is to listen to God say, oh, that one goes there, and to make sure it gets in the right place. It's very organized. And the proof, once again, right, the Zohar is the master of weak proofs. The proof is an out of context quote from Job, where it says, the night said, a male is conceived. So night is one of the many names for Shekhinah, right? She's got so many names that you can kind of find one anywhere. And as a result, this is their proof of the fact that kind of this sephirotic process of Bina and Shekhinah, these divine mother figures, are actually the ones who are appointing which soul is going where. But the most important piece of this is not the strangely bureaucratic soul assignment procedure, but actually the thing that was said in brief, which is that when a proper and sanctified sexual relation occurs, a spirit is aroused above, which is made of male and female, right? So there's a imitation, and this is typical of mystical texts in general. You often hear the phrase as above, so below, right? Symmetry is very important. What happens on earth also happens in heaven, and vice versa. So the notion of the conjunction of male and female through sexual relations means at the same time there's an image of there being a soul which is kind of established, which is now coming into fruition, not created because it already existed, but now ripening, which is male and female. The soul is equally male and female. It is androgynous. Okay. Of course, yeah, sorry. Sorry, Daniel, I didn't hear you.
I said, is that sort of male and female conjoined spirit, is that the Beshet then? So that's the Beshet that's then split, and then there's in later life.
Yeah, we're going to see that. They don't use that word precisely, but we're going to see how that gets to that idea, right? Because, not hard to imagine that if you've got, so there's two ways you can interpret this. If you say, oh, well, the soul that's assigned to a particular future human life is male and female, either that means that our souls are actually not of a gender, that they contain both male and female. This goes in the direction of kind of Jung and his interpretation of psychology, and the fact that everyone possessed both male and female attributes, and many people's complexes were a result of them not properly integrating the opposite gender aspect of themselves. So you could imagine it that way, that that's what's being described. Or the other way to imagine it is that actually the soul is androgynous when it's up there in heaven, but it gets split, as the Zohar is going to talk about, and the two pieces, male and female, go to two different bodies, which then kind of are aiming to reunite. And that's the kind of soulmate imagery. And the Zohar is going to play with both. It doesn't really decide as usual, but it's going to kind of think about what the options might be. Do you want to read one more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then the spirit descends along with a certain image, the one assuming the form above. In that image he is created. With that image he goes through this world as is written. Only with an image does a human go out. Psalms 39:7. As long as this image is with a person, he exists with his image in the world, for they are joined as one. And King Solomon warned people, saying, before the day breathes and the shadows flee. Song of Songs 2:17-2.
Okay. What are we talking about? We use the word image a lot.
It's almost as though like the physical form that grows is a reflection of the soul.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a I guess prototype, you could say, in some way, or a kind of included with the soul bits is also instructions on how to compose them in physical form. The word that's used here, tsuma, is obviously related to tselem in Hebrew, which is the word used in Genesis for the fact that humans are created in the image of God. Exactly what that means is $1 million question. It's also related, as the latter part of the paragraph is kind of playing with, to the Hebrew word sel, which means shadow, right? So sel and selim are very closely related. What exactly the grammatical relationship is not clear. But the latter verse, King Solomon warned people before the day breathes and the shadows flee, right? In that verse from Song of Songs, it's talking about the end of the day, meaning the sun is going down, meaning the shadows flee. And the Zohar is, as usual, reading this hyper literally and zooming in on the fact that it says shadows with an S and assuming that means there's two. So Zohar first says that there's kind of an image of a physical form, which is imparted with the soul contents itself. It's very hard for us to conceive about what exactly this looks like. But I think the best way to understand it is kind of like when you get a schematic of something with all the parts to make it, right? Like when you buy your IKEA furniture, you have a box full of just bits, but they also include a handy picture that shows you what it'll look like when you're done. Do you know what I mean? So the soul comes, bags of hardware and lumber that doesn't look like it fits together, and maybe there's a few pieces missing here and there, like most good IKEA furniture. But it also comes with instructions and an image of what it will look like when it's done, meaning that our physical form is actually related to and a manifestation of the internal spiritual nature of our soul. This is a common idea in the pre-modern world and still a common idea today. It led to lots of interesting ways in which people understood physical bodies as an indication of the soul. It leads to physical body-based divination, things like the very weirdly common Jewish form of divination where people would interpret the wrinkles on one's forehead and as a result understand something about their soul. Palm reading, another example of using the physical form of the body to assume that it contains information about the soul. All of those things assume that this is true, right? That actually your body is in some way a depiction of your soul. The other flip side of that, unfortunately, is that it's led to a very often dangerously unhealthy approach to disability, where people who look different or are in some way not normative in their body are then assumed to be evil or malformed in their soul, right? Which leads to about 2,000 years of discrimination and prejudice and murder against disabled people in a variety of communities. So it's a bit as with most of these ideas, right? It's a kind of a combination, a two-edged sword. And there's something very nice about the idea that actually our souls are embodied and come with an instruction manual and a picture of what they look like. But the Zohar has also got this warning, right? The warning is there's not just one image, there's two, which now gets really interesting. Anybody have two shadows? I don't. Right. The shadow, by the way, is their way of conceiving of the image, right? The idea is that your shadow is the image of you when it's kind of, in silhouette. When the light strikes you, the shadow shows you what your soul image looks like, which might seem stupid and unscientific to us. But, it doesn't take much investigation to realize that many, many, many cultures thought about shadows as a representation of the person and thought about shadows as having an independent identity and sometimes thought about whole shadow worlds, right? Very common, particularly a lot of Caribbean mysticism and folklore as well. So it's not unusual to think about the shadow as being actually, rather than just the light blocked out by your body, a real thing which depicts the image of the soul. How we think shadows? That's a real good question. Yeah,
I was just saying that's quite a common trope in sort of paranormal films where you'll have a person and then their shadow is cut, but their shadow has horns or wings, or
very good. Yeah,
like that sort of image.
Right, and what is that? The filmmaker is communicating to you without having to say anything that inside the form of this person's soul doesn't look like they're outside, and there's something menacing about that, right?
Yeah,
that's a really good way to try and imagine what the Zohar is doing here, which is talk about exactly that. What does the image look like that comes with the soul? What does it mean that there's two of them? Does that refer to the fact that we just read about the fact that the soul has two genders, that it comes male and female? Does it imply something different? we're going to see. Now we have a fantastic passage, and which I'm going to read because I want to, and then we'll come to David, in which the author, whoever is writing this, describes the book of black magic that they have in their handily in their possession. So it says, in the book of sorcery of Ashmedai. Ashmedai, by the way, in the Talmudic conception, is the king of the demons and the one who King Solomon tricked, and then tamed into making his kind of personal pet, which backfired on him horribly. There's an amazing story about that somewhere. In the book of sorcery of Ashmedai, I found that one who knows how to perform sorcery on the left side, that's the evil side, sorry, lefties, and to cling there, should stand by the light of a lamp, or in a place where his own images, plural, may be seen, and utter certain words, and invite his images to those whom he has summoned, and say that they are willingly prepared for their commands. Such a person has left the domain of his Lord and has yielded his pledge to the impure side. Absolutely fabulous, right? So this depiction, by the way, why would the Zohar include this if it's so dangerous? They're like, hey, do you want to know how to do this horribly evil thing? But they just drop it in there, right? And they say that they found in this book that there's a ritual you can do in which you can actually use your shadows to contain some demonic energy. Because in the Talmud and in Jewish conception, demons don't have bodies. Demons are really weak sauce compared to the Christian idea of demons. Demons aren't like fighting over human souls, none of that. They're not like anti-angels. They're mostly problematic pests. And they don't usually have bodies of their own. So they kind of possess other things, or they show up in natural ways or whatever. So this is some kind of ritual, evidently, in a book that we don't know of existing anywhere else, where you can actually kind of imbue your shadow with a demonic presence, and as a result, use it to command. So you can have it do stuff for you. Anyone read the books or currently watching the Netflix show based on the books? What's it called? Oh, now it's escaping me. But the Grisha trilogy. There's a bad guy in there who has two shadow monsters that come out of his body and attack people. And it's literally what's being described right here. So, yeah, I can't remember the name of the show right now. So obviously this is a bad person who does this, right? The Zohar takes pains to remind us such a person has left the domain of his Lord and yielded his pledge to the impure side. The impure side, the Sitra Achara, the other side, is the common way of referring to the demonic realm in the Zohar. Okay, so I'm going to read the next one then. David, you're going to be up. By those incantations that he utters, inviting his images, two spirits manifest and array themselves in his images in human form, and inform him how to harm and benefit at particular times. These are two spirits who were not comprised within a body, and now they are comprised within these images, arrayed in them, and they convey information to this person, one who has left the domain of his Lord and yielded his pledge to the impure side. Again, that title reoccurs. So they're just making really clear what's being described, is that there is some kind of magical ritual in which your shadows can take on a demonic presence, and as a result become independent of your body, leave your body, and can become both spies for you and teachers for you of all sorts of dark magic, and can be used to do things. You can command them to do things. They didn't used to have a body, and now their body is what were your two shadows. Wild, right? Any thoughts on that? Anyone tried this? Don't try at home.
It's just given me thoughts about, are we getting to that situation in a science fictional position with AI? You know, are we almost producing robots that can think for us and to do what we want? And instead of being a robot, it can be a shadow with, I suppose, with 3D printing. You know, it's everything coming together.
Yeah. It's interesting to read this in some way because it's kind of the anti-golem, right? The golem story is something that a righteous rabbi makes out of clay, which is a good thing because that's what humans are made out of in Genesis, and then breathes life into like God does and uses divine names and powerful white magic to animate it, and then it protects people. This is the reverse, right? We're just taking shadows, which aren't even something that exists at all, putting a demonic evil energy in them, using kind of dark powers in order to animate them, and then having them do harmful things to people. So it's like the polar opposite of the golem. And both of them are great analogies for AI. the good and the bad, perhaps. And many of the earliest stories about robots, a word which itself comes from a Czech author who had recently read the Golem story, and we didn't have a word for it in English, so English borrowed the word robot from the Czech language, right? All of the science fiction stuff around robots and AI, and now the reality of it, actually owes a lot to the story of the Golem. So this is the flip side. This is the dark side of that experiment with animating inanimate things.
Just makes me think of these animated avatar things that you can think it's a person, but it's not. It's AI.
Yeah,
the holograms
started being able to manipulate people to send them money, and they're doing all these crazy things.
Yeah, there's a really interesting kind of, if you ever got into cyberpunk fiction of the 1980s, right? There's something where science fiction and magic kind of coincide here. And this is magic, right? The Zohar is thinking about it as magic, but what they thought of as magic, we might experience as something different, because our world doesn't use that label, but the same thing might be happening. Who's to say?
I was saying holograms.
Yeah. Holograms, I mean, holograms are quite eerie, isn't it? Because it's a recreation of a three-dimensional image using basically a memory of a two-dimensional image. And this whole thing about two images, definitely, there's an eeriness to that. You can also use them for good, though, right? If you've been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., you can sit there and talk to the holograms of a bunch of Holocaust survivors who are no longer with us, who spent hours and hours recording themselves answering questions, and now an AI animates their hologram and talks to school children. Not that that's the same thing as what's being described in the Zohar. I just want to stress that. But it definitely taps into many of our own fears of our own world. Okay, David, do you want to continue with our next come and see?
It's probably too small for me because I'm on a phone.
Oh, that's fine.
There's a struggle.
That's all right. I'll continue unless anyone else wants to jump in. Come and see. A person is forbidden to throw away household utensils or anything else in his house and deposit it with the other side. So if you're a hoarder and you immediately thought, oh, yeah, I have an excuse not to throw stuff away. The key thing here is not throwing stuff away and depositing it with the other side, which must not be done. For many wardens of judgment are waiting to receive that object, and from that moment on, no blessing settles upon it, since it belongs to the other side. All the more so one who summons another, the other side, to dominate his supernal goodness, for it now belongs to the one that he summoned. Right, so love this idea that, so by the way, I had to look up what this means, and most of the commentaries describe that if someone's using something, like you're trying to get your blender to work and it won't work, and you throw it out and say something like, oh, go to hell with this blender, you're actually dedicating it to the other side. So it's what they're describing is the casual frustration of throwing something away and saying, in Hebrew, lech azazel, or whatever you might say, this common expression of kind of, damn that thing. Oh, all of a sudden you have a magic evil fork that's been occupied by a demonic presence. So there's a weird anxiety. The Zohar has a lot of anxieties. The Talmud has a lot of anxieties about demons, usually in bathrooms. The Zohar has a lot of anxieties about demons, evidently in kitchens. You have to be careful about throwing away your household utensils and not accidentally dedicating them to the other side. But forget your forks and your stand mixers. The real problem is you got to be careful not to invite these demonic presences from the other side to dominate yourself. And there's a very classic image here that someone who invites this evil force into themselves, they summoned it, but they end up being the one controlled by it, right? They think they're going to be in control. They end up being the one controlled. Okay. When a person's days draw near, the supernal image that was given to him, that spirit who clung to it every day, comes and takes it and is arrayed in it and goes away, and it never appears with that person again. Then he knows that he has been totally rejected. So, how do you interpret this?
Just the sort of the soul leaving the body at the point of death.
Yeah, it seems like it must be at least a little bit before death if he knows that he's been rejected. This is kind of consciousness. I think the commentaries might say elsewise, but I think this is describing the person just above, the demon summoner, who imbues his shadows with these evil forces. that someday before he dies, all of those powers desert him, and he actually dies without any soul at all, right? That's the kind of sacrifice. And by the time he dies, there's nothing left. And as a result, he doesn't live on because his soul was handed over to these demonic powers that now live in his shadow. It's very, very dark.
So he's where it says been rejected, that is as in rejected by heaven.
I get that sense. It feels very Christian, right? I mean, this whole idea feels very Christian, of demonic possession of shadows and kind of heaven and hell and souls being bargained between them. And, just because it feels Christian doesn't mean it is. There's lots of aspects of Judaism that share a lot with Christian texts. And by the way, this sort of stuff occurs very commonly in Muslim texts as well, and in a variety of others. I've got a fabulous book called The Devil's Atlas, which has a huge depiction of all the different cultural, historical, and religious kind of ways of thinking about hell. And boy, is it gruesome. Actually, there's some of them that are way more grim than Dante's Inferno, which I had to read in school and gave me nightmares. But actually, many cultures have way, way darker versions of that. And actually, Judaism is really weak when it comes to the whole kind of hell imagery. Even here, there's not really any hell. It's just that your soul leaves you. You get abandoned by your soul. It runs off with the demons and the dark shadows, and you end up without a shadow. This also might be a reference. There's a reference in the Talmud at one point to someone who doesn't have a shadow. And it might be a reference here to that idea that actually someone who's so evil that their shadow has been taken over by demonic forces can actually end up shadowless. Sounds like a great short story, right? The person without a shadow.
It makes you think how supposedly vampires don't have reflections and shadows, I think.
Yeah. I think, all the stories are telling the same thing, right? It's the same warning about kind of inviting danger in. Summoning vampires, right? The idea that the body can look like the body, but actually be something evil inside. Ultimately, they're all thinking about the same fear, which most of us don't think about at all.
No.
Or we think about it purely as the realm of fiction.
My question here is, it says on the previous page before you turned it over, it never appears with that person again. So are we to assume, to understand that it does appear with another person? Because don't we learn that a soul has only got one person to live in, and that's it? Once it's done with that person, it's done.
Yep. Yeah, I think the idea here is, I mean, I would guess that the language is about, because they're always quite euphemistic about reincarnation in the Zohar. They never really describe it in detail. That comes later. I think what they're saying is basically this person doesn't have a chance to be reincarnated, right? They're abandoned by their soul before they even die. And as a result, their soul is kind of taken captive. They forfeit their soul.
But it doesn't feel it.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I mean, it's not saying that it's an evil person. It's not connected to the previous paragraph necessarily. It's when a person.
You don't think so?
No, when a person's days draw near, so it's finishing up there.
Let's see. Yeah, so Denny Matt at least interprets it similarly, which is that it is about the previous paragraph. When his time approaches to depart from the world, the demonic spirit comes and takes his ethereal body, his soul image, which otherwise his soul would use in the afterlife. So the soul gets it doesn't have, because there's this idea that comes up in the Talmud quite a bit, that when you die, you have a kind of spirit version of your body that clothes your soul. So it looks a bit like you, but kind of like a ghost. And the idea here is that that image is being taken by the demons and not returned. Evidently, there's more about the danger of discarding things casually. Okay, let's take a look at this last bit. Robert, do you want to read again? We'll go back to the top. Mother, come and see.
Come and see. When the soul descends to be conducted into this world, it comes down to the earthly Garden of Eden and sees the glory of the spirits of the righteous standing row upon row. Afterward, it goes to hell and sees the wicked who are crying, "Woe, woe," with no one taking pity on them. In every respect, it is provided testimony, and that holy image stands above it until it emerges into the world.
Okay. I don't know if you guys were here previously, but there was one time we looked at another passage from the Zohar, which described extensively this pre-life soul journey. Yeah. So this is a hint to that. Again, it kind of repeats many of the same themes you see elsewhere. And the idea that before the soul goes into the body, it takes a little tour, right? The grand tour, goes to Garden of Eden, which is where all the righteous people are, and sees them all happily in a queue, it sounds like. And afterwards, it goes to Gehinnom, this kind of inversion of hell, and sees all the wicked who are really upset and no one taking pity on them. And so it's well instructed as to what the outcome will be. But the thing that's missing here, which is included in the other story and many other passages in the Talmud and elsewhere, is the idea that just before the soul enters the body, an angel puts their finger, the angel's finger, right between the baby's lips and makes it forget everything that it saw. So the soul has this education and then it is deprived of it so that it has kind of the free choice to make its own determination in the world. And this idea, by the way, the last line, that the holy image, so this image, again, going back to the IKEA diagram in some sense, like the picture of what the soul will be, the kind of ethereal body, the astral body, it's there with it, right? So before the soul ever even enters the baby's body, there's a kind of ghostly version of what presumably the adult will look like, which is accompanying the soul and with it and clothing it. And that's the thing that gets forfeit when the demons are invited in, which I don't recommend. Okay, should see what happens when it's born.
When it emerges into the world, that image is at its side, participating with it and growing with it. As has been said, for it is written, "Only with an image does a human go about," from Psalms. A person's days participate with that image and depend upon it, as is written, "For we are but yesterday, unknowing, for our days are a shadow upon earth." Job. For our days are a shadow, surely. From the day that a woman conceives until the day that she gives birth, no one knows how many and how exalted are the works of the Blessed Holy One, as is written, "How many are your works, O God? All of them you made in wisdom. The earth is filled with your creatures." Psalms.
So we've gone full circle back to that first verse, to both women giving birth, the reference to Tazria, and that Psalm 104 verse that was brought in the very first paragraph of this passage, which is about how all the works are made in wisdom, the earth is full with all the creatures. I linked it to this Job verse really nicely about the fact that our days are a shadow upon the earth. They're reading that as meaning that our days, meaning our life, is dependent upon having that shadow, having that image. I mean, how do we conceive of that image? What does that look like? Is it literally a shadow? Is it some kind of symbol?
Is it like leaving a mark?
In
a way, if you I'm trying to think, like on a very sunny day, if you've got something that can get bleached by the sun, you've got something in the way and the space under it is darker. Are we the thing in the way between the sun and the ground, and we leave that unbleached mark, or I don't know, something?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. There's something, there's like a residue of us being there, which is our form, our image in the world. It certainly sounds more positive than a shadow.
It's kind of a shadow, but not a shadow in the typical
more physical
sense.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, no,
an
like
imprint,
that.
Let's say.
An imprint. I think there's also a way to think about this. Remember, this is a world where the people are writing where there weren't really mirrors and there certainly weren't cameras. Right? The mirrors that existed were heavy leaded, largely just polished metal And they weren't accurate. They were like, if anything, like funhouse mirrors. So the only place you could see a real reflection was in water, and that as well was going to be distorted. And of course, the story of Narcissus tells us how much it was frowned upon in the ancient world to be the person who's always looking at yourself in the water. So most people didn't see themselves. We see ourselves constantly. We can see ourselves right now in the little boxes here on Zoom. Right? There's literally our image is projected in so many ways, so many places all the time. And we perhaps take for granted what a reflection would have meant to someone, and the idea of a reflection in the ancient world and what that would have been like. Now you often hear this kind of, I don't think it's true or factual, this idea that there were tribes in North America or elsewhere who refused to have their picture taken because they thought it stole their soul. Right. I think it's just an urban legend, but there might be some basis for it. But it could be that that's kind of what we're thinking about as well, is literally the image of what you look like is something that would have been quite unique to you, and there wouldn't have been copies of it, and there wouldn't have been opportunities to see it very often, and it wouldn't have been something that you were constantly encountering as we are today. So perhaps our own idea of how to imagine ourselves is very different, because we look at ourselves constantly, mirrors, cameras, photos. Some of us devote a huge amount of our time to sharing pictures of ourselves to our friends on the internet. And the Zohar could not have imagined that.
I guess the only thing that I'm not struggling with, but this idea that it's a map, that it's sort of not. Because at one point I was thinking, well, is it just our body? And the image is that it's the physical, it's what we are on earth, while the soul is, so the image is our body, and the reality is our soul, if you see what I mean. But then I was thinking, but that doesn't have the sort of essence of it being a plan, or because this bit about participating with the image and depending upon it as something a bit more where the image is a bit more sort of proactive in the whole process, if you like.
Yeah, there's a real sense of dependence.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't live without it.
Yeah, and I guess that's true of your body, but somehow that bit of it doesn't seem to fit with the idea of the image being the physical body. I don't know. Yeah,
I mean, obviously the answer can always be all of the above, especially with a text like this. They're kind of playing with the overlap of the physical and the spiritual, and this idea of an astral body or an ethereal body, of a version of ourselves which is not physical but nonetheless looks like us. It's actually quite a common idea in many cultures and to many people. If anyone's ever had what's often called an out-of-body experience, right, what that often feels like is like being out of one's body, but nonetheless looking and having your physical form in some way, but only in a almost ghostly kind of astral, ethereal sense. Whether there's any reality to that, whether it's a psychological manifestation, don't really know, but it could be that the Zohar is talking about something that to people in its time was quite obvious or familiar. Also, it's not intended for public readership, right? It was only intended for a small group of people to whom perhaps for them it was familiar, even if it wasn't to most. Just to add this little postscript, partially because we said we'd come to it, and we'll leave it there. Come and see. All spirits of the world, when they emerge comprising male and female. We read that already. Afterward, they diverge on their paths. If a person is worthy, later they couple as one. That is, he finds his mate, joining in one coupling entirely of body and soul. So there's a lovely idea, right, that actually the two-part soul, the male and female, gets split and then can sometimes be recombined in a loving, obviously heterosexual relationship is the way it conceives of. What they don't really address is that this isn't the only interpretation of that two-sidedness to male and female, And it could be, by the way, one of the things that we haven't really explored, but could be implied, is that this last come and see is a contradiction of what was meant to be understood before, where when it said there was two souls, two shadows, that shadows plural, two images, that what it meant was that kind of we each have a male and female image of ourselves that comes with the soul, and which one manifests kind of depends on, I don't know, social conditioning or how we decide, or our own being, whatever else. But there's kind of an idea there, perhaps, that this two-natured male and female isn't necessarily something that splits and recombines, but could actually be something, as I mentioned, Jung kind of interprets it psychologically, which each of us has within it, a male and a female image. What that would mean is a different question, actually, and an interesting one, and definitely challenges the idea of both sex and gender. So, as usual, the Zohar is playing with lots of things at the same time. Some of the themes here we've seen many times about the soul's journey before life. The idea of the soul is something which is kind of able to be compromised by darkness and black magic and the sorcery of the Book of Ashmedai, the kind of fear and anxiety around casual accidents in which someone compromises their soul, and also this sense that our physical reality is only a manifestation of a creation that happened, in essence, a long time ago, and which is coming into fruition now. And what we do with that is kind of, it's got a certain momentum that we can either carry on with or arrest. And there's a danger that we don't fully allow that process to grow and develop, which is kind of the idea there, perhaps, of the demonic, is that it intervenes with that natural process of creative development. Notably, by the way, to our first question, they never really decide on the idea of conception. And that last paragraph included the line, we don't really know what happens from the moment of conception until the baby is born. There's no interest in nailing down, oh, yes, it's day 42 that this happens. It's much more focused on the poetry of what happens in that time, as opposed to trying to particularly identify the process of conception in a scientific or a spiritual way.
I think that the very last paragraph there, you could interpret as quite harsh, actually, because it's almost saying that, if the two parts of the soul of the image would ever don't recommit, that's because you're not worthy.
Yes, yeah.
It's a bit like, that person's alone, but rather than feeling sorry for them, that's because they're not worthy.
Yeah. Exactly. It's the same. It's same as the experience of the kind of soul image body connection is, oh, that's nice, but also, it has certain implications that we might not like, right? All of these ideas are double-sided. And as many people, and there are many people who very much connect with the idea of soulmates and the idea of kind of, this is an inherent connection, and they might feel very inspired by this passage. Other people feel a bit offended, perhaps. And, they don't really address the complexities. They will, by the way, elsewhere, which is a whole different thing, but they don't really address the complexities of multiple marriages, which is a given in Jewish communities, which always had divorce, or, the complexities of people whose spouses die, or people who don't marry, or whatever else. So, nice ideas can have bad implications for people, sometimes without the people who are sharing them really thinking them through. And the problem, sorry.
Relates to what you were saying earlier about attitudes towards disabled people or disfigured people.
Yeah,
it's that same. Yeah, it's almost a callousness.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, I mean, ideas have real world implications if people accept them. And I think when we consider these ideas, many of which are foreign to us, right? Like the Zohar is full of ideas which are foreign to us if we grew up in the rationalist-minded West in the 21st century. Some of them are valuable and we might want to incorporate into our own thinking. Some of them we might not want to, and some we might want to pick and choose. And to me, at least, that's fine, because I think the benefit of this is that it's a treasury of tradition and not a cohesive theological system. It doesn't agree with itself, even in one paragraph. So there's no danger, perhaps, in being willing to pick and choose and consider and weigh what it is we're reading. Thank you guys for joining me and thinking a little bit about souls, shadows, and more. And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time, which I think is is that coronation day. And if you're around, and maybe we'll try and find something in the Zohar about monarchy and kingship, see if we can get a thematic link going. Lovely to see everyone. Hope you have a good week. Watch out, you don't invite any demons to take over your shadows, please.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
you.
Good night.